Hi, great to have you joining us today. A certain unnamed German chain of grocery stores has a great advertising line, I reckon, and you probably know it when I say it, but it's good different. Because there's that great Australian expression, you know, when we have food, when we watch a movie, when we see some fashion, and someone asks us what we thought of it, and we'll often say, well, it was different. And then they will ask, good different or bad different? And of course this particular chain is pitching themselves as different, but good different. And I guess when you look at a lot of things today, they're different. I'm old enough to be able to reflect on things in the past, and I reckon there's a lot more diversity in people, in their attitudes, in their tastes, in a whole lot of things today than there used to be. There used to be a lot of sameness. And again, reflecting even on my own family, because as I was thinking about it the other day, I thought my mum and dad were quite different, but good different. I just didn't know any better then, but they're probably different to a lot of other parents. My mum was the one that was into sport, and she probably passed on to me a love of sport and loved her Aussie rules in particular, which I loved. And she was a Collingwood fan even back in the day in Queensland, in Toowoomba. It wasn't a popular thing, but she loved the sport. My dad loved sport, but motorsport. And he was a motor mechanic, so he was, again, different, because a lot of people that had corporate jobs, they would dress up in a suit through the week, and then they'd dress down on the weekend. Well, my memories of my dad are going to work in blue overalls, but dressing up, suit and tie, every week for church. So here's this motor mechanic that would go to Speedway on a Saturday night and go to church on a Sunday. I guess I just thought it was normal. But as I reflect now, it's different. But I think it's good different. As my wife says, it takes all colours. It takes all shapes and sizes to make up the world. And it's okay to be different. And God actually calls us to be different from the world, to be good different. Even in Jesus' day, he told his disciples, he said, that we know some people and they love to lord it over people. They love to boss people around. They love to think they're superior to others. And he said 4 words that really challenged that. He said, not so with you. In other words, be different. Be good different. Be better different. Be stronger different. Be more resilient different. So if you're prepared to be different, to be good different, come with us today on the journey where we're looking at a guy who was called by God himself, not good different, because the phrase probably hadn't been invented yet, but we're looking at the story of Caleb. Caleb, who God said had a different spirit to people that existed in those days. So let's have a look at the story of Caleb, good different. In our series, as we've looked at it so far, called Messed Up, we've looked at a lot of people who, I guess, has been on the negative side. It's the messed side of things, the messed up. I want to look at the story today of Caleb, who was on the upside of things, and tell the story of Caleb, how he appears in the Bible, and then how we can learn from his great example and be one of those people who is good different in that way. So we start with the story of Caleb. He was one of the people of Israel that was finally released from captivity in Egypt after generations being there under the Pharaohs. And led by Moses, he was part of the team that went out and finally was freed, part of the Red Sea, hit the desert, and they were ready to go enter the promised land. And being a leader of his tribe, he was one of the people that was chosen to go and scope out this new land that God had promised them to have. And so we read in the Bible that it was Moses who had been able to rally the troops and to say, go into the land that God has promised and check it out. This is what we read. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev and onto the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they walled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So there's the scope, quite detailed, just to check out the land. God had promised it, and so they were just to check out to see what it was like. But when they came back, they were indeed impressed by what was there. The phrase, it was a land flowing with milk and honey. The grapes were so big, people had to, the crops that they got, they had to carry them with 2 men. It was massive. It was fertile land. But they went further than the brief was. And when the 12 spies, the 12 people that went into the land, those leaders of the tribes, came back, they actually then went further than Moses asked them and said, we can't do it. The people are big. Sure, it's a great land, but the people are so strong, there's no way we could do it. And we shouldn't even try. And one of the things I've learned, certainly doing theological studies, is the importance of precision. To be precise in our language. If someone is expressing something, it's important in those terms to be precise as we can in what we mean, in what we say. And these people went beyond that. That wasn't the question they were asked. That wasn't in their brief. But they went further than that. So 10 of these men stood up and said, we can't do it. We might as well go back to Egypt, as they said often. But it was Caleb who stood up. And later on we read this. Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. So he was one of the positive people there. He was one of those people who, with Joshua, only 2 of them stood up and spoke positively. And God was so upset with this, so upset with their lack of faith, as often happened as they whinged about stuff in the wilderness, that he said, look, none of you are going to go in. We read later on in Numbers, not one of the men 20 years old or more who came up out of Egypt will see the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Not one except Caleb, son of the Kenizzite, and Joshua, son of Nun. So he distinguished himself because of that. Now, one of the things that struck me, I'll say again later, in re-studying the story of Caleb, is that this meant from this time on, for 40 years, he would have to wait for his whole generation, 20 years old and more, to die out before he would get to that promised land. And that's what he did. They wandered around, all sorts of stuff happened, and even Moses didn't get to enter, but finally Joshua and Caleb got to enter the land. He was 85 years old. And it says in the book of Numbers, God's description of Caleb, my servant Caleb has a different spirit. In other words, as I said, the phrase hadn't been invented yet, but God's saying Caleb is good different. He distinguishes himself amongst all the people of that generation. He's different from them. He has a different attitude. He has a different spirit about the way he acts. So what was it about Caleb that was so good different? What was it about him that distinguished him amongst all his people? Let's have a further look at that now. So what are those qualities of Caleb that made him good different? The first one is this. First one is that he followed God with all his heart. He followed God with all his heart. That's what that scripture says when we read that God is making that value judgment of Caleb. It says, my servant Caleb has a different spirit. It says after this, because he followed the Lord with all his heart. He followed me wholeheartedly, God says. I think that's one of the greatest descriptions. There's great descriptions of other people in the Bible, some quite negative ones too. But for God to say to someone, here's someone distinct from all the people of his generation, or many of them. He followed the Lord with his whole heart. One of those things that I've reflected on over the years is how hard it is, how difficult it is to preach on different subjects. sometimes there's end times, sometimes there's still theological things that are quite hard to say as well as quite hard to explain. And there's been a whole lot of moral dilemmas that we've had to deal with. But I think overall, one of the most difficult subjects I've ever had to deal with is this idea of full commitment to God. Because it seems almost so foreign to people of the world. It seems so foreign sometimes to people in the church, because we see the fanaticism and the extremism that sometimes comes with people who claim to follow God but are doing all sorts of crazy things, and we think, do we want any more of that in the world? The Apostle Paul was someone who talked like that, of that total commitment that he had. He talked about the value of his life being nothing except for this desire that he had to share the good news of the gospel with people. On one occasion, he talked about dying daily. We were going to have at Westside a baptism Sunday, and we had a few people lined up to baptism, so I hope that is still able to happen. Baptism is when we die to our old life, we die to ourselves, and it's an initial event of that coming into relationship with God that many people experience and want to express. But Paul says, I die daily. Baptism is not just the one-off thing, and I've died to myself once and I don't need to do it again. He said, I need to do it every day. Because it's one of these countercultural things that we die to our ambition, we die to our aspirations, we die to the desires that we have, we've got to die to the greed that's in our lives, we've got to die to those things that the world sees so important, but we're really struggling with in our own lives. And that total commitment is something that actually is so rare. And even the best of people suffer from that half-heartedness. Solomon was one of the greatest kings, the wisest people to ever live. But the Bible says as Solomon grew old, his wives led his heart astray, and he was not fully devoted to God as the heart of his father David was. Solomon had some great advantages. He prayed to the Lord for wisdom, and the Lord not only gave him wisdom, but gave him riches as well. He entered into many political and alliances and had many wives. He stood on the shoulders of his father David and took the kingdom of Israel to a whole new level in his time. But one of the great sadnesses, even as wise as he was, is that Solomon allowed things in his life to take him away from that wholehearted, absolute commitment, nothing else, devotion to God. And that's one of the things that distinguishes Caleb as being good, different, in his wholehearted relationship with God. Another thing we see with Caleb and what he was doing, what made him good, different, is that he suffered, but through the suffering had a right attitude. As I said earlier, one of the things that struck me in studying this again is that Caleb had come back from spying out the land, from checking out the produce of the land, had come back, had given a good report, was positive, God was pleased with him. God said, you will enter the land, but nevertheless, you've got to travel around with all your companions. You've got to travel in the wilderness for 40 years. You've got to wake up every morning thinking, if it hadn't been for these guys, I'd be in the promised land. I'd be in the milk and honey. I'd be eating these wonderful grapes. And he had to live with this suffering that he didn't cause, that he had nothing to do with it. It was all the fault of these other people. And all of his contemporaries had to wait to see them die one after another, go to their funerals, see them pass away, all the time thinking, I should be in the promised land. He suffered for what other people had done. One of the things that used to give me dread when I was a kid at school, not necessarily a surprise exam or something like that, but when the teacher would say group assignment, group project. Because, if you're lazy, you can get away with it. But if you're a conscientious student like I was, you tended to do all the work and had all the passengers. In fact, there's a joke meme someone had sent around that said, when I die, I want the people who I used to participate in group projects with at school to lower me into the grave so they can let me down one more time. Obviously that person has a deep-seated hatred as well of group assignment. But we can get that sort of attitude where we're blaming other people, sometimes rightly, for all the things that have been going on in our lives that are bad. We're suffering from what other people have done. Maybe what our parents have passed on, maybe what someone has done to us. And rightly, there's some terrible things that have been done to people. And Caleb suffered from that too, as I said, knowing every day that he got up, knowing he could have been in the promised land if it wasn't for the people that were around him. Yet, and I guess it's an argument from silence, we don't see anything of that attitude coming through. If he had that, if that was that burning up in his soul all the time, if it hadn't been for you guys, this is what I would have been doing. I think we would have seen it explode in some way, in anger or something like that. But we don't see that at all with Caleb. He had a different spirit. And I think the same is true when we see injustice, when we have stuff done to us. It's really important that we enter this with the right attitude. I think we see it important in the book of Philippians, which we have been doing in our daily devotions. And Paul is saying at the end of this, I love the old J.B. Phillips translation of this. It says this in Philippians 4. If you believe in goodness and you value the approval of God, fix your minds on the things which are holy and right and pure and beautiful and good. Model your conduct on what you have learnt from me, on what I have told you and shown you, and you will find the God of peace will be with you. And it's not just thinking nice thoughts, and it's not just, being in another world, but I think it's really important that we understand that we can be consumed by the things that have been done wrong to us. We can play them over and over again in our minds. We can replay them. And Caleb, I think, was able to overcome that. Because what we see next, this next quality of Caleb that made him so good, different, is that when he went to the promised land, he had a totally different attitude. He didn't explode in anger. He didn't say, now it's time for me to slow down. He had a different attitude. Next we see what else made him good, different. The next thing we see with Caleb, the third point that really made him as that good, different sort of person, is that he had a goal that he pursued with passion. He had a goal he pursued with passion. For 45 years, he was wandering around in the desert. He finally got to go in. And a couple of weeks ago, early on in this lockdown, we looked at the story of Joshua and Caleb in the Battle of Jericho. So we see that Caleb was quite active in this. They didn't just walk in and it was automatic. But we read in the book of Joshua, Caleb says, "Here I am today, 85 years old. I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day." You can see the passion in him. You can see the fire in his bones still as an old man, 85 years old. But he said he's still as strong and passionate today as he was then. So he obviously didn't have that attitude of woe is me. He didn't dwell on his misfortune. He was really strong to be able to keep that passion going for the things of God even later in his life. And I think that's one of the great things about Caleb, and that's one of the things I admire as I get older. I see people way older than me who keep that fire in their belly for God. I know life is hard, and so many things happen to us along the way. It tends to knock the enthusiasm out of us, knock the stuffing out of us. We've been hurt, we've been burnt, we've been let down, and it's easy just to pull back. But where are those people who, with fire in their belly, still want to see not just a physical hill, but the spiritual idea? As we looked in the Lord's Prayer a couple of weeks ago, that idea of, Lord, your kingdom come. May your rule break out in this world. May we see it in the church. May we see a church that, even though we haven't been meeting physically, that we have an opportunity to be your kingdom, to be an expression of love, where different races can come together and we don't have the judgment because of colour of the skin. That we can be united in Jesus. Lord, give me a passion for that. Give me this hill country, Caleb said. Give me the kingdom, Lord. Help it come out in where we live, in my suburb, in my street, in my house, in my heart. May we see it because of our passion for God, that we don't come across as weird or wacky, but we come across as passionate, as someone that we can, people can look up to, that people can see as a good example, that are winsome in their own way, that exude a different spirit, despite what's happened to them, maybe because of what's happened to them. They rely on God and God empowers them. There was a passion, even at 85, in old Caleb, for him to do what he did. I love the quote from Oswald Sanders, a great Christian writer of the past. He says this: "The hardest part of the journey is the middle mile. There's enthusiasm of the new undertaking that buoys at the start, the thrill of reaching the goal at the finish. But it's the middle mile where you're a long way from the start, and home is still distant, that tests the mettle of the runner. On the middle mile of life's pilgrimage, the believer needs most the grace of patient endurance." Maybe there's Calebs out there who have that great potential, but in that middle mile, in the desert, are in danger of dropping out. I want to urge you, really want to encourage you to follow that example of Caleb, to have a different spirit to those around you. Not to have the sort of spirit that gives up, not to have the sort of spirit that looks down because of what's happened to you, not to have the sort of spirit that, you know, you're doing what everyone else is doing, but to have a different spirit. To have a spirit that keeps going, that wants to claim the promises of God, that has that passion and that goal and that dream to see the things of God expand and extend as you would give it influence in the world. We need people like that. Will you step up and be one of those people? One of those people to be a Caleb, to be strong, to be a good, different person. Again, I love another quote from John Newton, who wrote the great song Amazing Grace. And he had been a slave trader, an awful man by his own admission. And when he wrote that line, that saved a wretch like me, he was really being fair dinkum of what a wretch that he was. And towards the end of his life, as he reflected on where he was, how far he'd come, he wrote these words: "I'm not what I ought to be, how imperfect and deficient. I'm not what I wish to be. I hate what is evil and would cling to what is good. I'm not what I hope to be. Soon I shall put off mortality, and with mortality all sin and imperfection. Yet though I am not what I ought to be, nor what I wish to be, nor what I would hope to be, I can truly say that I am not what I once was, a slave to sin and Satan. And I can heartily join with the apostle and acknowledge, by the grace of God, I am what I am." And I trust by the grace of God you will strive in your life to be good, different. That even though you are messed up and other people may have messed you up, you would concentrate not on the messed, but on the up. That you would be good, different. As we've been saying, I'd love to contact with you, make contact with you. If you want to have a chat, let us know how you're going and how we can help you with your next steps in the faith, how you can grow and be a Caleb and be good, different. My email address is up there, the church phone number is there. You can call and leave a message if no one's there. Great to have you joining us today. God bless.